The Nazis' macabre experiments on human beings. In the shadowy corners of 20th century history lurks a macabre chapter that still sends shivers down our spines for its brutality and lack of humanity: the Nazi experiments during World War II. In this episode, we delve into the darkest pages of history to explore the inhumane acts committed in the name of science and ideology. From gruesome medical experiments to forced sterilizations and atrocities committed in the name of racial cleansing, these horrors have left an indelible scar on humanity's collective conscience. Get ready for a journey through time where reality surpasses fiction as we unravel the details of the most gruesome Nazi experiments in human history. If you want to learn more about historical mysteries, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and enable notifications to stay up to date. And now, let's get started. Freezing experiments. One of the methods used was to submerge prisoners in freezing water to study the effects of hypothermia and to find ways to assist downed Allied pilots in the water. In these experiments, prisoners were forced to remain in extremely cold water for extended periods of time, often until they showed signs of severe hypothermia. The goal was to observe how the human body reacts to low temperatures and how to increase resistance to cold exposure. These prisoners were subjected to inhumane conditions, and many perished as a result of prolonged exposure to freezing water. Not only did the Nazis carry out these atrocities with complete disregard for human life, but they also sought to use the knowledge gained for military purposes. These are the consequences that prisoners suffered after undergoing these types of experiments. Severe hypothermia. Prolonged exposure to cold water causes rapid loss of body heat. Hypothermia sets in quickly, disrupting the body's normal functions and causing extreme weakness. Limb freezing. Low temperatures cause the extremities to freeze, resulting in severe tissue damage. In some cases, this has led to the loss of fingers, hands, feet, or even entire limbs. Cardiovascular collapse. Hypothermia can cause the cardiovascular system to shut down. The heart and other vital organs begin to fail due to prolonged exposure to extreme cold. Fainting and loss of consciousness. Extreme weakness and loss of body heat often lead to fainting and loss of consciousness. Lack of proper circulation contributes to these symptoms. Death. In many cases, prisoners did not survive prolonged exposure to extreme cold and died as a result of hypothermia, cardiovascular collapse, or other medical complications related to the experimental conditions. Sterilization and eugenics experiments. The Nazis conducted sterilization experiments in a variety of ways, using surgical methods and other invasive techniques. These experiments were part of the Nazis' eugenics policy, which aimed to purify the Aryan race by eliminating those deemed genetically undesirable. Surgical sterilization. Surgical sterilization was one of the most common methods used. These procedures included tubal ligation for women and vasectomy for men. These procedures blocked the fallopian tubes in women or the vas deferens in men, preventing the possibility of conception. Radiation. In some cases, radiation techniques were used to sterilize individuals. The goal of radiation exposure was to damage or destroy reproductive tissues, thereby preventing reproduction. Chemical injections. The Nazis also experimented with chemical injections to sterilize people. Toxic chemicals or irritants were injected into the reproductive system to damage the reproductive organs and prevent conception. Inhumane experiments in concentration camps. Prisoners in concentration camps were selected for these sterilization experiments. Many were operated on without their informed consent. Nazi doctors used prisoners as test subjects to perfect sterilization methods and techniques. Selection and elimination of the useless colon. In addition to direct sterilization methods, the Nazis implemented selection programs in concentration camps where those deemed useless were sent directly to their deaths. This included people with disabilities, hereditary diseases, and other defects. According to Nazi ideology. Radiation experiments. These experiments were designed to understand the effects of radiation on the human body and to develop radiation protection measures. Radiation experiments at Auschwitz. At the Auschwitz concentration camp, the Nazis conducted radiation experiments using radiation sources such as X-rays and gamma rays. Prisoners were deliberately exposed to lethal doses of radiation to study the effects on their bodies. Experiments at Dachau. At the Dachau concentration camp, radiation experiments were conducted to test the effectiveness of certain types of clothing and materials in protecting against radiation. Prisoners were exposed to doses of radiation while wearing different types of clothing to evaluate their protective ability. Human studies to develop radiation protection. In addition to direct exposure, the Nazis conducted human radiation studies to develop methods of radiation protection. This included research on the effectiveness of certain drugs or substances in reducing the harmful effects of radiation. Dosage experiments. Experiments were conducted to determine how much radiation the human body could tolerate before reaching lethal levels. These experiments often resulted in the death of prisoners exposed to extremely high doses. All of these experiments on humans were designed to increase their protection in war, to make them invincible against all odds. Pharmacological experiments. The purpose of these experiments was to test chemical substances and drugs and to explore methods of intoxication. The following is a description of how some of these experiments were conducted. Testing toxic substances. The Nazis conducted tests of various toxic substances, such as poisons and chemicals, on prisoners. The goal was to observe the effects of these substances on the human body, often with deadly results. Research on stimulants. Experiments were conducted to study the effects of stimulant drugs on human performance. This included the use of substances such as methamphetamine to evaluate their ability to keep soldiers awake and alert for extended periods of time. Experimental vaccine trials. The Nazis conducted experimental vaccine trials on prisoners without their informed consent. These tests were designed to find ways to prevent or treat various diseases, but the conditions and methods used were inhumane. Studies on resistance to chemical agents. Experiments focused on the human body's resistance to various chemical agents, including toxic gases. Prisoners were exposed to these substances to observe their effects and to find ways to protect German troops on the battlefield. Sterilization by gas experiments. The Nazi regime implemented eugenics programs aimed at racial cleansing by eliminating individuals deemed genetically undesirable. One of the methods used was sterilization by gas, a process that contributed to the systematic and cruel loss of human life. As part of these programs, particularly Action T4, extermination and murder centers were established where these experiments took place. These centers, such as Hartheim, Graefneck, Hadamar, and others, were designed to appear as medical facilities, but were in fact places of horror. Victims were selected from those considered incurable, handicapped, or simply unfit according to Nazi criteria. These individuals were led to believe that they were undergoing routine medical examinations, but in fact they were led into gas chambers disguised as showers. Once inside, they were exposed to poisonous gases such as carbon monoxide or Zyklon B gas. Sterilization by gas was not only intended to eliminate the possibility of reproduction for the victims, but was also part of a broader extermination program that ultimately led to the Holocaust. These experiments were conducted primarily on women. Women were selected from those considered genetically undesirable according to Nazi ideology. When the gas was released into the environment, women would inhale it or absorb the poison through the skin and mucous membranes, affecting the respiratory system and preventing the body's ability to use oxygen. This method resulted in instant sterilization for stronger women and death for weaker ones. Twin experiments. These experiments were conducted primarily at the Auschwitz concentration camp. Cruel medical experiments on twins were conducted as part of pseudoscientific research led by the infamous Joseph Mengele, known as the Angel of Death. These experiments were inhumane and violated the basic rights of human beings. Mengele was particularly interested in twins because their identical genetics allowed him to compare the effects of his experiments on individuals with the same genetic makeup. These are the experiments conducted by the Angel of Death. Sterilization experiments. Mengele performed sterilization experiments on twins, using methods such as tubal ligation on women and castration on men. These procedures were inhumane and left the twins with permanent physical and emotional scars. Experiments with eyes and different eye colors. Experiments were conducted to change the eye color of twins through chemical injections or surgery. Mengele was also interested in twins with different eye colors to study the genetics behind this trait. genetic and anthropometric experiments, detailed measurements and genetic studies were performed on twins to better understand the hereditary and physical differences between them. These experiments often involved taking blood samples and performing rudimentary genetic analysis. Blood transfusion experiments. Mengele conducted blood transfusion experiments between twins to better understand the effects of these transfusions on individuals with the same genetic makeup. Among these experiments was the case of Eva and Miriam Moses. These two twins, at the age of 10, were subjected to injections of unknown substances and cruel genetic and medical tests. Despite these events, the twins survived the Holocaust, and Eva Moses Kaur has spoken about her experiences on numerous occasions. Despite the trauma, after the war Eva dedicated her life to Holocaust education and forgiveness. Resistance and toxic exposure experiments. These experiments were related to resistance and exposure to toxic substances, often with the goal of gaining military advantage or advancing Nazi ideology. At the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, the Nazis conducted experiments in which prisoners were exposed to toxic substances such as mustard gas. This gas was known to be a blistering chemical agent that caused burns to the skin and damage to the lungs. Prisoners were selected for these experiments without their informed consent and were often subjected to extremely dangerous conditions. In the case of mustard gas exposure, the Nazis sought to study the effects of the gas on the human body while also finding ways to protect their own troops from such attacks. Prisoners were directly exposed to mustard gas, either by inhalation or skin contact, and their physical reactions were carefully observed. The results of these experiments were used for military purposes, although the information obtained lacked scientific and ethical validity. As this video concludes, it is important to reflect on the horrors of the Nazi experiments and to remember the lives lost and the suffering inflicted on thousands of people. These dark events in history serve as a stark warning of the dangers of ethical degradation and the perversion of science. In remembering these horrors, we commit ourselves to be guardians of justice, tolerance, and equality, and to work together to ensure that history does not repeat itself. Education and awareness are our most powerful tools to prevent intolerance and inhumanity. Let us continue to study history to better understand our present and build a future based on mutual respect and the value of human life. Thank you for participating in this reflection, and may this knowledge inspire us to build a more compassionate and just world. Until next time.